America, the freest goddamn country in the world. And how did we get this freedom? The same way we've given it to countries all across the globe, through free market capitalism. Free market capitalism has made America and the world freer and more prosperous. It has given us all the luxuries and all the products we could dream of. But markets aren't just for products. The free labor market has allowed consenting people, many of them adults, to sell their labor for an agreed price called a wage. What could be fairer? The free market is the best and only way to organize society in a way that maximizes freedom for all. That doesn't sound right. The free market is given almost religious deference by many as this sort of benign force operating within capitalism. This guiding invisible hand must be left to work its magic so that we can all prosper together under capitalism. It's often contrasted with the economies of so-called really existing socialist states like the USSR as the only way of living free. But this idea of truly free markets acting completely separate from governance has never really existed. Under really existing capitalism, markets have always been regulated and supported by governments. On top of this, the market systems under which we live have never produced freedom. There have always been winners and always been losers. Those with more power and those with less. This first video will explore how markets have never existed totally separate from intervention, and the second will explore how markets don't create freedom but often oppress us in ways we might rarely even consider. So let's begin with the logic of free markets. The godfather of free market capitalism and pin-up model for market fetishists, Adam Smith. Oh, what a babe. He argued that capitalists acting out of competitive self-interest would act in ways that would ultimately benefit society. They would have to produce quality goods, sell them at competitive prices, and treat labourers well lest they leave and work somewhere else. Never mind that labourers often don't have a choice of where to work, and the choice, if they don't work, is starve. Never mind that. Like an invisible hand, this competitive self-interest would result in the moral and material needs of society being met. Contrary to what many think, this wasn't the limit of Smith's thought on governance. For Smith, managing the economy is a political task which requires the state to enforce not just capitalist property rights, but market regulations to restrain the excesses of competition and ensure society didn't descend into brutality. Even the real classical liberals knew that total market freedom was a myth. So for the past 400 years or so, many of us have been living under systems which have been directly descendant from that sort of classical liberal philosophy. And yet, we've never reached that libertarian wet dream of a total free market. And why is this? Firstly, I think it's good to look at the self-proclaimed ideological descendants of Adam Smith, the neoliberals, who were at the forefront of extending market logic through every area of life. Neoliberalism emerged as a dominant ideology in response to Keynesian economics. In Keynesianism, government would tax high and intervene frequently. Neoliberals like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek saw this as a sort of form of collectivism that would take us down the road to serfdom under socialism. They sought a minimal state that would act at most as an impartial umpire in the market. The problem for neoliberals, though, is that every single really existing neoliberal state has wielded state power pretty mercilessly to support the market ideology and to push it into new areas of life.
The real miracle in Chile was not that those economic reforms worked so well. Chile is by all odds the best success story in Latin America today. The real miracle is not that those economic arrangements worked so well, because that's what Adam Smith said. The real miracle is that a military junta was willing to let them do it.
A good example of this merciless wielding of state power would be something like the Thatcher-era anti-union labour laws, most of which haven't been repealed yet. These laws, which regulated the action of labour unions, doing things like banning solidarity strikes, are an example of the state intervening in the labour market to ensure that the sort of neoliberal free market ideology was upheld. The state was no impartial umpire, but was instead dedicated to expanding and supporting free market ideology as far as possible. Another example of this would be, say, the bailing out of the banks after the 2008 financial crash. The neoliberal state is often seen as one that's constantly retreating, but while there was massive deregulation of financial markets and the state retreated to an extent there, what happened after 2008 was that the governments across the world stepped in and bailed out the banks, bailed out the financial system, bailed out the free market system with all the public money it needed, and then transferred the cost of the bank's failure directly onto the people. In the UK, this was expressed through austerity, through which we are still living.
There's going to be a bailout.
Well, they had to. Right? I mean, paper markets would
They
collapse.
knew.
Cash would stop coming out of ATMs. They had to backstop this.
They knew the taxpayers would bail them out. They weren't being stupid. They just didn't care.
Yeah, because they're fucking crooks.
I think this gets to the heart of why the neoliberal project is so utopian and incoherent. It wants to create this sort of free market paradise, but it's pragmatically impossible to do so because the state always needs to step in and ensure the conditions for the market exist, and then to stop it from failing. Also, quite clearly from the 2008 financial crash, we can see that the assumption that self-interest always leads to positive results is, false. I mean, maybe free market capitalism is a good idea in theory. It's just unrealistic in practice. No, it's also a bad idea in theory.
Marge, I agree with you in theory. In theory, communism works. In theory.
So, monopolies are an incredibly good example of such self-interest undermining the free market logic. Monopoly is what happens when one business or a group of businesses acting in coordination completely dominate one area of production or the provision of a service. The so-called rules of competition just fly out the window in that circumstance. They can charge whatever they want or produce poor goods or act completely unethically, and there's nowhere that the consumer can go because they own the entirety of that sector. Now, defenders of free market capitalism will look at monopolies and see them as market failures, or as the result of interference with the free market even, which is, that's a fun stretch. But as economist Anthony Martinez points out, the sheer number of market failures means that we should stop viewing them as bugs of the system, but as features of it. Incidentally, Martinez isn't a socialist, but what Lenin would call a bourgeois economist. He defends capitalism, but thinks that the government should step in to regulate it and to make it just. Lenin would have balked at Martinez's defense of capitalism as a system, but would have agreed that market failures are not bugs of it, but features of it. Specifically, Lenin saw monopolization not only as a feature of capitalism, but as the defining feature of capitalism, at least in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Through examining how almost half of American production was carried out by just 1% of total American enterprises, Lenin argued that the very dimensions of market capitalism led inexorably towards the concentration of production. We can see this in modern capitalism today by looking at the concentration of, say, food production. as shown in this graph here. As we can see, 10 companies own almost half of all of America's food production. And outside of food production, 6 American companies own 90% of their media, and 37 banks have consolidated to become just 4 from 1980 to 2010. Freedom of choice is one of the often cited virtues of free market capitalism, but how much choice is there really in a system where 10 companies own all the food? This is one of the many reasons why there's no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. With every purchase you make, you are in some way supporting these mega corporations. So either a government steps in to stop this monopolization, or the logic of the free market fails entirely. Monopolization hints at another reason why there can never be a apolitical free market completely separate from the state. With the concentration of capitalist production, there will always be a concentration of power in fewer and fewer hands. The classical liberals assumed that the capitalists would act within their own self-interest. What do you think a small cabal of rich and powerful people will do if they act in their own self-interests?
Self-interest is okay because it's about making money while doing good for society or people in general. Again, creating value for values we discussed in the first part. So again, I subscribe to self-interest. I'm not about selfishness. This is Victor Antonio reminding you it's okay to be a capitalist.
No. I think they're probably going to try and ensure that they keep their wealth and power. I mean, yeah. They'll try to capture the systems of governance that ensure that they keep and expand upon their wealth by securing government contracts, tax breaks, and support. This can be seen by looking at the UK's current Chancellor, Sajid Javid, who used to be a city banker with Deutsche Bank, where he was involved in tax avoidance and some of the worst excesses of the casino economy, which caused the 2008 financial crash. And he's now in charge of the UK economy. We can watch this capture happen in real time by looking at the Democratic primary contest right now, where it's almost so overt that it's funny.
My good friend Joe, and he is a good friend, he's received contributions from 44 billionaires. Pete, on the other hand, is trailing. Pete, you only got 39 billionaires contributing. So, Pete, we look forward to you. I know you're an energetic guy and a competitive guy to see if you can take on Joe on that issue.
The concentration of production and power has accelerated during the neoliberal age, and it might be tempting to assume that if we went back to the more managed capitalism of the Keynesian era, that we'd sort out these problems of capitalist greed influencing politics. I think we should ask ourselves how the neoliberal era began in the first place. It began because the already concentrated power of big enterprises and rich capitalists funneled money and influence into politics through think tanks and universities to promote a system that would make them even richer and even more powerful. Keynesian capitalism failed, and neoliberalism took its place by exaggerating some of the forces that made Keynesianism fail in the first place. Any solution to this system can't just tinker around the edges of capitalist markets, which inevitably concentrate power, but have to go to the heart of how power is accumulated in the first place. In this video, I laid out the capitalist liberal position from which free market ideology has stemmed and how it still requires an interventionist state. I've laid out how current free market ideologies, in fact, wield state power quite ruthlessly to regulate and support markets, despite their utopian free market ideology. I then argued that markets could never be free because their existence tends towards a concentration and monopolization of the production process of wealth and of power. Either a government has to step in and protect the free market logic of competitiveness, or the market is left free and the capitalist liberal logic of market competition ceases entirely. Finally, I make the point that free market capitalism will always concentrate power in the hands of a few who will use that power to maintain their position. The only way to truly guard against this concentration of power is to question the very production process itself. And that question goes straight to the heart of capitalism. In the next video, I will show that the market system, free or otherwise, doesn't produce freedom, but oppression. So, thanks for watching. Do all the like and subscribe and leaving a comment, that helps apparently. And share a video with anyone who you think might be interested or not interested. Just, you know, share it. Anyway, see you next time. Cheers.